Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. Thanks for being here. Today I'm forging a Kephart style blade, which was popularized by turn of the century writer and outdoorsman Horace Kephart. And we're starting with a billet of pattern welded or Damascus steel. And this is a combination of 1095 and 15N20 steel off of a sawmill blade. So I put some WD-40 on there, which helps shield the steel during the initial heat up. And here I'm using flux, which is just borax, and that provides a very good shield against oxygen for the steel. That's important because any oxidization between those layers will inhibit the forge weld from occurring, and you won't get a good piece of steel, which of course is not good. This is the initial weld pass here on the press. You can see I'm not really compressing the steel much, maybe 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch perhaps. The goal is to simply press those layers together at the proper temperature and create that forge weld. You'll notice the billet appears to be steaming here, and when you're using flux, that's a good indicator that you're up to a proper or a good forge welding temperature. I need to compress this billet down to about 3/8 of an inch and keep the width uniform. Keep that scale knocked off of there. If you press that into your billet, that can create some annoying problems and large divots in your steel, which make it harder to do the next forge weld because you have to have everything flat and clean. And here I'm flattening this on this billet on the flattening dies, getting it nice and smooth as possible prior to cleaning it up further. You can do this by hand with a hammer. It just takes a long time. I was able to get about 3 pieces out of this billet, and you'll notice the ends are discarded, and that's because when you run a welding bead on the pieces of steel to keep it all together before the forge weld, that welding bead kind of disallows those pieces from forge welding right at that spot, and that's just part of the process. There are other ways of holding your steel together, but this is a pretty simple and easy and quick method and reliable. So you just discard the ends, and that's part of the process of making pattern welded steel. So now to clean up the surfaces that are going to be forge welded again, all that forge scale oxidization has to come off, and we need clean, bright steel. And of course this has to be done in the beginning. I didn't bore you guys with doing this with 26 different pieces of steel, which is what the layer count is at this time. So these 3 pieces will give us a layer count of between 70 and 80, depending on how many get ground off here in the cleaning process. And this is our second forge weld in the press. Sure is nice to have that machine. It's a blessing. I wouldn't be able to make Damascus blades and sell them at any kind of reasonable price and time frame if I didn't have that. So just making sure that everything is forge welded together, and then drawing the billet out again. And I do a 3rd forge weld on it to get up to between 200 and 240 layers, depending on, again, how many were ground off during the cleaning process. And you'll notice the steel appears to be quite hot still, close to welding temperature. And when you're moving large amounts of steel, you need to make sure that it's at a good heat. When you're just doing some hand hammering, you don't necessarily have to have that same kind of heat. So now we're up to over 200 layers, and it's forged out into a nice piece of stock. And we'll start forging the actual knife out now. And the Kephart blade has a spear point style tip to it, so that's what I'm starting to forge out here. And the billet here, or the bar, is about 3/8 of an inch thick, which is much too thick for a knife blade, but you'll see the purpose in that. That took about 6 hours to make that billet, forge it out, and get up to the layer count that I wanted, and just begin the forging process on the actual blade. So this is the next day. Get the forge going here. And of course, have to put it back together in the back there. Very high tech door right there on the forge. Fortunately, today was cooler, and it's always nice to have lower temperatures when you're running the forge. So you see I forged the tip out a little bit more. Now I'm going to mark out some lines where I'm going to grind grooves in the side of the bar, and you'll see why in a minute here. You also notice that the length that I'm doing that at is only about 3.25, 3.5 inches. And that's because with the thickness of the bar, once we draw that out, we're going to have our length or very close to it, maybe a little extra. So grinding these grooves in the bar is what's going to reveal the layers. Basically, when we draw it out, you're going to see the sides of those grooves squished down to a 2D dimension. And you'll notice that I'm not grinding all the way through. There's still a thickness down that middle, and so that means that our pattern is only as deep as those grooves, as it were, once you squish those down like is happening here. But drawing the bar out, squishing it down here in the press, putting a little bit of a distal taper in that, and the blade, the piece of steel is still thicker than the blade's going to be, which is important because we do have to grind off the outer layer, get rid of those little lines there. But there's plenty of stock there, and the pattern's where it needs to be. So cutting off the tang end, obviously it's much too short, but I'm doing a tapered tang on this knife. I like a tapered tang a lot of times for several reasons. One, it saves on stock, which is a big deal with Damascus or pattern welded steel for obvious reasons. It also reduces the weight of the knife and adds some nice balance to the overall blade or knife when you finish the product. Using the round dies really makes that go fast on drawing that out. Now I'm just going to forge the handle out and bring that down to the dimensions and stretch it out a little bit more. The press is a very useful tool. The thinner the steel gets, the less effective the press becomes, and even so, there are things that you just can't do with the press, and so hand forging is still certainly a big part of the process here, obviously, particularly in forging the actual blade out of whatever piece of steel that you're using. Just continuing that tapered tang down and getting my finished dimensions on the handle, or very close to finished dimensions. I typically forge the handle or the tang closer to finished dimensions than I will the blade. The reason for that is on the blade, I want to make sure that I have enough steel to grind off at the end of the process during the finish grind to get rid of the decarburized layer of steel. Doesn't matter what kind of steel you're using, you're going to have decarburization in a open atmosphere forge or heat treat process. Different steels will decarburize differently, more or less, than others, but it's still something that happens to your steel no matter what. Right here I'm straightening the blade as much as possible, getting things flat and true as possible. I find this really helps during actually every process after this. The straighter, flatter, and truer you can get your forged blade, the better. You're gonna reap the benefits of that in the normalizing process, the rough grinding process, the heat treating process. So that's what I'm doing here. Now I just want to define roughly where the edge begins and where the handle ends. So I'm just sketching out some rough dimensions or approximate dimensions on the blade here. I want about a 4.5 inch blade with about a 4.25 inch edge perhaps. The Kephart style blade has a little nub of a hand guard right there, which is what I'm sketching in. So putting that in there, and then that gives me a good idea of where the bolt holes need to go in the tang. So I'm just going to put those in as well. And of course, using the center punch. It's really important to have a center punch when you're drilling steel. I didn't show it, but I did do a quick abbreviated anneal on the tang where I heated up to an orange heat and put it in the ceramic insulation blanket for a abbreviated anneal, and that really helps with just drilling the holes. you don't have that center punch there, as you can see, I had trouble finding it right there. Your drill bit will skate around, so you want to make sure you get that in there, especially with the tapered piece of steel like we're dealing with right here. We're almost ready to normalize the blade, which is the first part of the heat treat process. But first I'm going to just define the profile, clean that up, and get everything straight and true, even more straight and true. And the reason for this is normalizing requires uniform heating and cooling to be effective, or as effective as it should be or could be. And so I want to get the blade ground to a clean, uniform state. I'm still leaving plenty of material on the blade, particularly, that I'll grind off later. But I want everything flat and true, which allows the steel to cool as uniformly as possible. You can see how much it needs to be flattened, even though we got it pretty flat in the forging. It takes a little bit more. So here you'll see the distal taper in the blade and the tapered tang. So it's almost like a very, very gradual diamond shape, if you will. That makes the thickest point of the blade right there, the juncture of the handle and the blade. And that just makes a nice using blade, balanced, strong, but not any unnecessary weight or steel to the blade. So this is our normalizing cycle, and I do a total of 3 thermocycles. The following 3 cycles are for grain refinement, and the normalizing cycle particularly is crucial. It relieves a lot of the stress created by forging and puts everything back where it needs to be, and those processes are a very important part of making a quality blade, particularly when you're forging a blade. So I'm just doing a rough grind here, and that brings a uniform edge thickness that's still much thicker than the finished edge, but preps it for quenching. And I like to do it so that there's less material between the finished edge and the quenchant, so we get a good cooling rate. Quenching the blade here. You'll notice I don't keep the blade in the quenchant very long, and that's because it's really just a matter of less than a second that the steel needs to cool from about 1485 degrees down to about 800 degrees. And then I take it out around 400 or 500 degrees, and it continues to cool, and I'll dip it back in there to make sure that it's still cooling down at a reasonable rate, but not super fast. And that provides you with the best results, because you're not creating a whole bunch of stress, unnecessary stress. The steel is still doing what it needs to do to reach full hardness. And that's about it for part 1, guys. Thanks for watching. You'll see the pattern here is kind of revealed where the scale blows off the steel. The nickel steel still holds the darker color, and so the pattern is actually reverse of what it's going to be on the finished blade, but just making sure it's straight. And there you have it right there. So appreciate you guys watching. Stay tuned for part 2. We'll see you on the next video.